Maybe before we get into this lesson, maybe we could just get the ball rolling on some of the stuff we already might know about the Middle East. Like, I don't know, some of the religions that are there, what the geography is like, maybe what an issue is in that part of the world. We've touched on this a little bit already. We learned about Afghanistan, that's part of the Middle East. Do we know anything about that part of the world? Ooh, conflict with the U.S. Put it down. Yeah, you might know or remember that thing we learned about, the Taliban. Well, the Taliban helped Al-Qaeda conduct the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Okay, so the Middle East and the people there sometimes can pose some threats to us. That is a thing. And conflict overall is a theme, unfortunately, with this particular part of the world. And we're going to get into some of the historical backstory as to why. We're going to try to answer the questions of why is there conflict here? Why is it that many of the countries there don't like us and the European countries so much? And what is the root, basically, of all this hatred? We'll get there, though. What else do we know? Okay, we've got Islam as a popular religion, and a Muslim is a person who practices that religion. Excellent. A lot of oil, right? Oil is the key resource. Wars have been fought over the control of the oil supply. We're going to talk more about that later this week. What else? How about a geographic feature that dominates most of that area? Desert. Not dessert, but close. One S. Is Islam the only religion you're going to find in the Middle East? You're going to find a lot of Christianity in the Middle East. Okay, we're going to dive into some religious issues today, okay, and how that ties into people's behavior and why people do the things that they do. Any other ones? Maybe one more of the monotheistics that got its start in that part of the world? Not Buddhism, not Buddhism. That's more of an India-China thing, not the Middle East. But good guess, good guess. Judaism, yes. All three, and this is one of the reasons why this is a part of the world that's always in conflict, is all three of these groups think that the Middle East is important. They all want to control it. Did you guys learn about the Crusades in 9th grade at all, or touch on that word at least? Right? Wars to control the Holy Land. Well, the Holy Land is this tiny little strip of land right here that contains a very important city called Jerusalem. And all three of the groups have things in that city that are important to them. And we're going to get into that a little bit today. We're going to center our attention today and tomorrow right here. This strip of land here, the strip of land is called Palestine. Inside the strip of land, you have the modern day country of Israel, which has only been around since 1948. There are other territories inside of here that are not independent. They are just regions that are occupied by the Israeli army, where Arabic people live. Okay, so I'm going to use a lot of words interchangeably. If I say Israeli, that is a person that lives in Israel that practices Judaism. If I say the word Palestinian, that means a person who lives here of Arabic descent. And most of the time, people of Arabic descent practice which religion? Do we know? Islam, yes. Okay, so if I say a Palestinian or an Arabic person, they're practicing Islam. Okay, so two groups live in this tiny area. Israelis have their own country. The other people, the Arabs, do not. They just live in chunks of land occupied by the Israeli army. And as a result, they're not so happy about the situation. And since they don't have their own country, oftentimes they get kind of ticked off. I'll prove to you that this is an enduring problem. So let's take a look at the readings. What we're going to do is we're going to break this down piece by piece and do some questions here and there, okay? Because this is probably the most confusing topic, I would say, for the entire school year. It's also really hard for me to teach. So I find it simpler if we just take it piece by piece instead of trying to do it all in one shot. One of the roots of the issue is the religious roots, and that's the city of Jerusalem. If you were to go there, especially the part that's been there forever, right, the original OG, if you will, Jerusalem, you're going to find three really important religious sites. One, for Christianity, it's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That's the site where the Christians believe that Jesus was crucified. Okay, so again, this is not a religion class, but people with their religious beliefs, they take action on those beliefs sometimes, and that creates history, right? So if you're a Christian, right, Jesus is obviously important to you. This is therefore an important site, and you as a Christian would want to be able to go there and not, have that threatened, the denial of going there threatened against you. The Dome of the Rock exists at the site where Muslims believe Muhammad went to heaven. So if you are a Muslim, that's a really important spot. If you're Jewish, There's a place there called the Western Wall. It's like a piece of concrete. That's all that's left of a Jewish temple that existed until the Roman Empire destroyed it in around the year 70 AD. Okay, so because Jerusalem was like the ancient capital of the Hebrew state that existed there after, again, according to the religious stuff, Moses got the Hebrews out of Egypt. They walked around, they found a place to live, boom, pow, let's create a country. Jerusalem was their capital city. So if you were to like put this in chronological order, Jewish people were there first. Then they were kicked out by the Romans, and then when the Roman Empire fell, the Muslims moved in. It's like that, a classic argument. Like imagine this scenario, guys, right? Imagine tomorrow a member of the Iroquois nation comes to your door. Knock, 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 Mr. Cellini, hi, I am so-and-so, I'm Iroquois, my family lived here a couple hundred years ago, we would like the land back. That's valid, right? What am I going to tell that person? Because I'm not going to give it back. So what am I going to say? What would be my counter argument?
So what am I supposed to do?
What am I supposed to do, right? Where am I supposed to go? And I would probably say, oh, but I've been living here for a while, and before me, my parents lived in this house. Why should I give it back to you? That same kind of scenario is exactly how it's playing out in that strip of land called Palestine. The Jews are saying, we were here first. Jerusalem is our ancient capital. The Muslims are saying, yeah, but you weren't here when we got here. You were long gone. And we've been here since about 600 AD. So why should we get up and leave? Okay? It's got there's religious issues at play here, and there's also just straight up land control at play here. And both sides claim ownership. Never mind the Christians who also want to be able to go there without the threat of violence against them. So let's get into some of the big time issues here. Let's flip to where it says, what was the Sykes-Pico agreement? But before we look at this, let's try to make a comparison, because then if we can, it'll be easy in our heads. Do you guys remember from the last couple of days what the Europeans did in Africa that later led to maybe some conflict in those places? They split it up, right? The Europeans split it up. They redrew the boundaries. And when they redrew the boundaries, whether intentional or not, what happened in those new boundaries once the Europeans left? What was problematic about the boundaries? They didn't follow the pre-existing boundaries that people already had, right? So they put people together that historically don't like each other so much. And we as humans, oftentimes we have difficulties dealing with each other, right? So if there's a lot of animosity, a lot of hatred, and now you're living with that person, bad things might happen. The same thing is going to happen in the Middle East. Does anybody remember which empire controlled a lot of this territory, like modern day Middle Eastern countries, before they became independent? We learned about them like second week of school. The Ottoman Empire, great, right? If we could just talk our way through this, then we don't even have to bother reading it. The Ottoman Empire was on which side in World War I? The German side or the American side? The German side. Which side won? The American side or the German side? America. Okay, so the Ottoman Empire lost World War I. So this empire, whatever was left of it, is gone. Who do you think took control of it now that they lost World War I? The British and the French primarily. The Americans want nothing to do with this. They kind of want to go back to being isolated after World War I. What happens is the British and the French, they go to these territories and they say, oh, this part is mine, this part is mine, this part is mine. Do you guys remember the word we used? It was a fancy term for when a European country took control over a place, but then said at a later date, you're going to get your independence. Mandate. Excellent. So, very good. So all these territories that were once part of the Ottoman Empire, under the British and the French, become mandates. They tell the people in Mesopotamia, guess what? You have a new name. It's called Iraq. And oh, you got two different types of Muslims here and you don't like each other? I don't really care. Okay, I'm going to redraw this boundary. I'm going to control this. My name is Great Britain. You're going to have to find a way to get along because I want access to this arable land right here, right? Mesopotamia has always been a place, right? Even though the ancient civilization is gone, that land is still valuable for the arableness of it and the fact that oil comes out of this part of the world. So the British get this chunk of land called Iraq, and they get this. They get themselves Palestine. But remember, what a mandate is you're telling the people there, one day we will give you independence. Problem is, there were two groups of people who lived in Palestine. They told the Jews, one day the Jews will get their own country and independence, and they told the same thing to the Arabs living there. One day you will get independence. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing how this can cause conflict here. You're making promises to two different groups. And instead of becoming independent, which is what they thought they were going to get after World War I, instead, here we go again, Europeans are taking over. Okay, it's basically imperialism. So let's talk about this first section together. I'm just going to give you some notes since you guys pretty much did it. Okay, the sites in the old city of Jerusalem that were important to Christians, Jews, and Muslims, it's those three places we mentioned. Okay, for Christians, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Okay, for Muslims, it is the Dome of the Rock. And these things like right next to each other, guys. Same neighborhood. And for Jews, it's the Western Wall. All three sites, members of these religious groups, if they're very devout, right, they want to go to these sites and pray. Right? Maybe you remember something about Islam from last year, right? One of the big parts of that religion is once in your lifetime, you got to go to Mecca and pray. Well, this is kind of like along the way. It's like on the way to Mecca. And a lot of Muslims want to go here too. It's like, oh, Muhammad went to heaven here? It's a good spot to pray. I am down. Oh, Jesus was crucified here? That's a good spot to pray. Okay? If you are religious, and if you're a member of those three religions, you're very into these religious sites. Okay? Sykes-Pico Agreement. These are the two representatives from Britain and France who orchestrate this conversion of the Ottoman Empire into mandates. So let's just put Britain and France here. Sykes represented Britain, Pico represented France. I'm never going to ask you which one goes with which. Okay, the point is, just like with the Berlin Conference, guys, we've got yet another situation in which the European countries are redrawing boundaries and determining the fate of other parts of the world. And hopefully you see by this point that that doesn't always work out so well. Oh yeah, we'll divide up India into India and Pakistan. That'll solve the problems. Not so much, right? Oh yeah, we'll divide up Africa and we'll redraw the map and it'll suit our own interests. What did that lead to? Conflict in Africa. One effect of the Sykes-Pico Agreement is, like I told you guys, Ottoman lands, Ottoman territories would become mandates controlled by the British or the French. New countries are later created from these territories. Okay, places like Iraq, Syria, Iran, they have not been around a long time. Those countries have only existed since World War II. Okay, and if you were to look, I'm not going to make you read this, but it mentions that in Iraq, this number 3 here, it put together these 3 types of people, which I know gets kind of confusing and we're not going to get super into it. Sunnis, Shiites, and Kurds. We'll save the Kurds for another time. Sunnis and Shiites are 2 different groups within Islam, just to make it even more confusing. And if that sounds weird, every religion has this. Can you guys think of like multiple groups of people who are just in general Christians? They all believe that Jesus is the Son of God, but there are differences. Can you think of any? Catholics, right? The most popular one are the Catholics. Who else is a Christian group? Mormons, yes, you're right. Mormons are Christians.
Lutheran?
Lutherans.
Or Jehovah's Witnesses?
Jehovah's Witnesses are. Yes, they are.
Protestant?
Protestants, right? Christianity has the most. And historically speaking, that has fueled conflicts, right? When a bunch of people in Germany in the 1500s said the Pope is whack, that caused religious conflict. That caused religious wars in Germany for like 30 years. So same thing in Islam. I'm not going to get into why there's differences, right? That's a story for another time. But when you force together 2 groups in a religion even in the same religion, who don't like each other, that could lead to conflict. Iraq has had civil war periods as well, because the people within it, despite all practicing Islam, even within the religion, there's diversity. The world is very confusing, guys. Okay, so when you get like the big picture stuff, guys, when you get new territory boundaries where people are different, it's going to lead sometimes to conflict. So based on the text, what about this agreement could lead to conflict? New boundaries were created that contained a lot of cultural and religious diversity. In addition, there would be animosity against Europe because people in the Middle East were promised independence, yet were denied it. The British and the French were really happy with people in the Middle East because they were rebelling against the Turkish government The Ottoman Empire was Turkish. They were rebelling. So the people in what would become Iraq and Iran were like, oh, finally, we're going to be independent now. The Ottoman Empire is defeated. The British and the French are going to have our backs. No. The British and the French came in and said, nope, this is a mandate. This is a mandate. We own you. When we think you're ready for independence, we'll give it to you. That led to a lot of animosity. Okay, so this helps us answer a lot of questions about the Middle East. Like, why is it that we have all these little countries? Why is it that we have conflict within them? And why is it that some of the people, not all, let's make that clear, some of the people in the Middle East have long, deep-seated anger towards Europeans? Okay, there are more terrorist attacks levied against the Europeans than there ever have been against Americans, something to keep in mind. It goes back to after World War I when they redrew this map. There is talk every once in a while about redrawing the map yet again to kind of make less diversity happen, but that's a really hard thing to do. It's hard to draw maps and make everyone in a country the same. Good luck. It's never easy. Let's do a little bit more, and then I'll let you be. Scroll to, we're going to read the next section together. Why have Israelis and Arabs been fighting all these years? Okay, so again, try to keep some of these terms in your head. When I say Israelis, I mean a Jewish person from or living in what you would call Israel today. An Arab, remind me again, what religion does an Arab person practice mostly? Islam. Okay? An Arab person practices Islam, and if I say an Arab person living in Palestine, sometimes we call them Palestinians. Okay, Palestine, again, is a strip of land where Israel is. I know this is insanely confusing, but if we dig through it piece by piece, it should get more clear. Why are they fighting all these years? It's really a fight over land. Jews trace their biblical roots here. All right, so again, if you read the Old Testament, right, it said that Moses got the Jews out of ancient Egypt. They started walking around the desert for 40 years, and eventually they found a place to live. This is that place to live, right? So the Jews are like, yo, it's in the Bible. This is our home, yo. Like, we want it. It belongs to us. Palestinians, who again, just to be confusing, are the Muslims, right, with an Arabic descent, who've lived there for many centuries, say it now belongs to them. To fight over who was there first versus who has been there. At the time of Israel's founding in 1948, Jews had been vulnerable exiles. If you're vulnerable, it means you're kind of at risk of being targeted with persecution or violence. What does it mean if you're kind of like living in exile? Kick them out, exactly, right? So the Jews were a vulnerable group of people who had been kicked out of places. They were exiled without a country of their own since they were expelled from their ancient homeland by the Romans in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. So Jews were here between the time period of Moses and the Roman Empire, and now they're gone, right? And they're like, oh man, but that was where we got our start. That's our OG home. We want that back. Okay, at the end of the 19th century, the 1800s, as Jews became the victims of violent pogroms across Russia, and we learned about that, right? In the early 1900s, one of the reasons why there was a Russian Revolution is because the Russian government was mistreating people. This is one of the ways they mistreated people. Okay, Jews in Russia were targeted for violence because the king of Russia, the Tsar, was like, I know how I can create peace in my country. We'll make everybody Christian. And if you don't fit the mold, you got to go. So just like in Nazi Germany, the Russians did the same thing. So Jews were fleeing Russia because of violence. So Jews known as Zionists began arguing that their people needed a state of their own. And after the end of World War II, when 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust, the idea gained wider support. Understandably so, right? After World War II, the world was like, yo, the Jews have been picked on way too much. Let's give them their own country. So let's think about that for a second, right? And when I say state in this context, I mean country. If Jewish people had their own country, in theory, how would that make them safer as a people? Yeah, how are you going to get kicked out of the you're not going to get kicked out of the country if you're the ones in charge, right? I don't think if you study history, I don't think you're going to find a lot of cases in which the majority group is the one getting picked on. It's always the minority group. So the theory went, if we gave Jewish people their own country, where they were the majority group, they would not be subjected to harassment anymore. So people are thinking, all right, what's the best place for this? Let's go look at the world, see where Jewish people are living. Oh, there's Jews still living in Palestine? Oh, that's their ancient capital. They were there first. Simple solution. Make Palestine a new Jewish country. Sounds simple, but you tell me, who was already living there since 600 AD? Who was already living there? The Arabs, right? So you can't just give it to Jewish people. Someone was already living there. That's going to pose a problem. See, here it is. The problem was that for the over the previous 2,000 years, the Jewish homeland hadn't remained empty. In the earliest 20th century, when large numbers of Jews began moving to the area known as Palestine, tensions erupted with Palestinians and other Arabs who lived nearby. Fights broke out, right? A bunch of Jews were migrating to what they considered their ancient capital, but there were already people there, right? And that put population pressure on the area. There was not enough housing. There were not enough jobs. It led to some conflict, right? It's one of those stories of mass immigration somewhere. Sometimes the people that are already there aren't so receptive. Complicating matters, during World War I, Britain made separate and conflicting promises for statehood to both Jews and Arabs. Statehood means the creation of a country, right? The British, they controlled this, right? It was a mandate. They told the Jews, yeah, Jews, one day, this is going to be all yours. Then they said the same thing to the Arabs, right? So both groups, they were like, yo, what are you doing here? Like, what's going to be the solution? You promised both that we would own this land. So what do you think they did? If you were to guess, if you're the British, there are two groups of people living in that area. Maybe you can get a sense of it based on that map. Two groups that hate each other, living in an area, both want a country of their own in that area. What do? Divide it up. Where did they just do that we learned about? One area, the British were in control of it. There's two groups there that hate each other. They divided it up, one for each religious group. What place was that? India and Pakistan, right? The British were in charge of it. They wanted independence. Britain said, fine, but you all hate each other. We're going to create two countries. So that's what they did in Palestine. All the orange was supposed to go to the Jews, and the yellow was supposed to go to the Arab Muslims. You tell me, what's problematic about that split? Does that look weird to you in any way? It's not evenly separated, right? There's a large disparity here. It's definitely not 50-50. What else is bad about it? Is the Arab area all connected together? No. It's hard to run a country when it's split apart into separate areas, right? You have to build roads now through Jewish area, and those people don't like you so much, right? That might pose some problems. It's easier to run a country when it's all connected together. Right? It was a big deal when, the fact that we can control Hawaii and Alaska is only really a testament to our technological skills. It's hard to run a country when you're separated by another country. Plus the Canadians, not so much a threat. With claims for the land still unresolved, the United Nations in 1947 voted to partition Palestine. Like Anthony said, to separate it out. Partition means to separate. Jews accepted the plan and the following year founded Israel. But Palestinians who considered the deal unfair rejected it. Right? Because if you are an Arabic person, a Palestinian now we're going to call them because they live in Palestine, you're not going to accept this because this all used to belong to you. Now the United Nations is stepping in and saying, just kidding, half of it's going to belong to you. You're not going to be so happy about that. But here's what happens next. In 1948, Israel's Arab neighbors attacked. So the day after Israel became an independent country, all the Muslim countries around it attacked it. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, all sent troops to this part of the world to take that land away from Jewish people and give it back to the Muslims. However, they lost, which is crazy. Israel survived and even gained some territory. Palestinians, on the other hand, remained stateless, with 700,000 people displaced. That means kicked out and forced to find another place to live. That sets the stage for an even bigger showdown 2 decades later in 1967. Okay, so Israel becomes independent, but the day afterwards, a war is declared. And even though Israel is up against all these powerful neighbors, Israel wins, mostly due to U.S. help. And we have a situation in which the Muslims in this area still don't have their own country. They live under Israeli occupation. Let me just give you a couple answers before we call it a day. Why do the Jews need a state of their own? If Jews had a state of their own, they would be the majority group and not subjected to persecution any longer. Remember, the world felt a lot of sympathy for Jewish people after the Holocaust, understandably so. So people are like, give Jews a country where they are the majority group, and then we can resolve this anti-Semitism problem. So Jews start migrating there, started to migrate to Palestine, and the Palestinians, the Muslims, right, that were already there were like, what's going on here? This is our land. You cannot come here. So what did the UN decide to do? They partitioned Palestine, one state for Muslims and one state for Jews. But the Muslims rejected the plan and declared war on Israel. The Muslims lost. So I want to pick up where we left off yesterday, and it's a very complicated topic, and this is the grand plan that they came up with. This was how they were going to redraw the boundaries. In Palestine, the orange would become Israel, and the yellow would be the country of Palestine for Muslims, and Jerusalem would be controlled by neither of them, because no one could seem to agree on who should control it. No one gets it. It will be governed by the United Nations, and it'll be a protected area for both Jews, or for all three groups, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, to go visit if you want to hang out at the Dome of the Rock or the Western Wall or the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And maybe you already kind of know this, I think we mentioned it yesterday, or maybe you saw it to some extent in your homework. Which country traditionally always has the back of Israel? Gives them tons of weapons and support. America, exactly. All right, so that is what you can use to explain how is it that little Israel is able to defeat all these other countries around it. Between U.S. support and these countries being kind of weak at the time, Israel wins, and they gain more territory. And we're going to fast forward now to the year 1967 when they gain even more territory. So we're going to go through a couple more of these reading passages, not all of them, just the ones that are the most important. All right, so if you scroll, you're going to find a section that says, what was the 6-day war and what were the consequences? Over the course of 6 days, Israel basically doubles its territory, is the long and short of the story. The stated goal of Arab nations in 1967 was to destroy Israel, but it backfired. Remember, these Arabic countries don't even believe that Israel has the right to exist, and they keep looking for ways to try to take it down. By the end of the conflict, which lasted less than a week, Israel had more than doubled the territory under its control. Tensions escalated in May 1967 when Egypt took actions that Israel considered hostile, right? So threatening. Egypt expelled United Nations peacekeepers, right? Those people around the world trying to ease tension, and it mobilized forces in the Sinai Peninsula on Israel's border, and it blockaded the Straits of Tiran, Israel's economic lifetime to the Red Sea. Let's just break that down piece by piece. Do you guys remember from the World War I unit what it means to mobilize troops? Yeah, move them, get them into position to do something, right? The world was on edge for like a month when Russian troops were mobilizing on the border of Ukraine, because we knew that something was up. You don't just put troops on the border of a country just for fun, right? You have to organize them, pay them, supply them with weapons. So in 1967, the Egyptians, okay, it's hard to see on this map, but Egypt is right here. The Nile River would be where my mouse cursor is. This peninsula right here is part of Egyptian territory. And the Egyptians were mobilizing their troops right on the border of Israel, and they cut off this waterway down here to Israeli ships. So if you were looking to sail out of here into the Red Sea, and the Red Sea empties into like the Indian Ocean, so if you want to go places, you would use that, that was shut down. So if you're sitting in Israel, you're scared because the Egyptian troops are right on your border. You could do one of two things. You could wait for them to invade, or you could strike first. And Israel chose to strike first, just like with World War I, right? Germany didn't wait to be invaded by Russia. Germans went on the offensive during World War I. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. Israel feared an invasion and staged a preemptive strike on June 5th, right? That's when you take action first. Flying low to avoid radar, 200 Israeli jets wiped out virtually the entire Egyptian Air Force within hours. Pretty sure those Israeli jets were American produced. And soldiers conquered Egypt's Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip. Syria dispatched tanks and jets, but again, Israel's superior air power gave it the upper hand, and it gained control of the strategic Golan Heights, more territories. Jordan entered the fray, losing its territory on the west bank of the Jordan River. So big picture stuff, this war happens, and over the course of 6 days, Israel acquires more territory. They grabbed the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, this chunk of land here. They grabbed this strip of land here called the Gaza Strip. They grabbed this chunk of land here called the West Bank. And they grabbed this chunk of land right here called the Golan Heights. Okay? 6 days, they gobbled up, probably over doubled their territory in the course of just 6 days. Again, with the help of America. So when we're trying to understand why some of these Muslim groups don't like us so much, right? They hate Israel, don't want it to be there, and yet we support Israel, right? So there's a connection there. There's like a chain of hate, I guess you could say, if you will. Israel also captured eastern Jerusalem from Jordan, right? So if you look at the capital city here, Jerusalem, half of it was controlled at one point by the country of Jordan, but now after 6 days, all of Jerusalem now belongs to Israel. And you probably remember why that's controversial, right? it's not just Jewish sites in Jerusalem. There's Christian sites. There are Islamic sites. Now all of it is in possession of Israel, and Muslims are especially ticked off about that. All right, I won't bother reading the rest of this. The point is, all the religious sites are now under the control of the Jewish community. So let's go to the questions and see if we can summarize some things. Can somebody just tell me really quickly what caused this war to break out? What provoked Israel to invade territories? Yeah, right? Egypt mobilized its troops on the border of Israel. Right? So makes sense. Why would you wait to be invaded? They decide to strike first. Very confident. The Israeli military is no joke, and they get U.S. support. I forget the exact number of years, but I'm pretty sure every Israeli citizen has to serve in the military for 2 years out of high school without any choice. You have to do that. A lot of countries have that. Even France, I think, has that still, which I know seems kind of foreign to us because we're not required to do that, but a lot of countries have that. Okay, so a war is fought, and then you have the results. One general effect of this is that Israel gains new territories from the Muslims. And I'm just going to list a couple of those important ones. Sinai Peninsula, not Mount Sinai out east, Sinai Peninsula. Gaza Strip, West Bank, and East Jerusalem. The most important prize of all. Now the entire city belongs to Israel, right? So Jerusalem went from a city that was supposed to be not owned by anybody, right? It was going to be governed by the United Nations, this internationally supported city where everyone can go if they want. Now it's going to be completely owned by Israel. So the Muslim community is very upset about that, still to this day. Okay, so that just fueled even more tension. And since the late 1960s, people keep proposing ways to try to resolve this conflict. Like, what could we possibly do? What can get everybody to calm down and stop fighting each other? Can we divide the land up? What land should be given back? Can we just have war? Is that going to be the only solution? So a lot of people keep proposing the two-state solution. This idea that we'll just create one country for each group, going back to what it was like in the 1940s. Problem is, it's kind of hard to compromise when each group of people wants full control over everything, especially with Jerusalem. No one's ever content on splitting that city in half. It's kind of like an all or nothing type of attitude. Most people think that the best chance for peace between Israel and the Palestinians is to create an independent Palestinian state consisting of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Right? So if we were to take a look at that map, a lot of people keep saying, I got a simple solution for this. Right? If you look at the region, simple. Gaza Strip, this little green chunk here, and the West Bank, we'll just call that the country of Palestine, and we'll be done with this whole thing. You tell me, though, just like before, why is that compromise maybe problematic? Why would maybe the Muslims reject to this and this being their country? It's still not connected together, right? And again, it's not Canada in the middle that's going to just give you a free donut at the rest stop. No, it's people who don't like you so much, right? Good luck building roads and railroads through Jewish territory and having airports. Okay, so from a Muslim point of view, this isn't so great. Okay, also compounded with something else going on here too. Since the 1960s, all these red dots here, these are Jewish neighborhoods that are being constructed in the West Bank, which was supposed to be a piece of land that was going to go to the Palestinians. All right, and the Palestinians are like, how can we accept this peace arrangement when there's so many Jewish communities here? We need them out. If we're ever going to agree to any kind of compromise, you got to get your people out of here. And the Jewish communities don't want to leave, right? It's kind of like, again, that whole argument, who was there first versus who has been there. So very complicated. I hope you're seeing how complicated of an issue this is. No one can seem to figure it out. One of the main sticking points has been the Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which Palestinians see as their future capital, right? Just like I showed you guys. These dots represent Jewish communities inside this West Bank, which is supposed to go to the Muslims. Palestinians demand that Israel withdraw from the settlements and return to pre-1967 borders. So go back to what it was before that war. But some Israelis argue that the settlements are necessary for security along its eastern border. At the other end of the country, Israel is also concerned about Hamas, the group which controls Gaza and which the U.S. has classified as a terrorist organization, occasionally shoots rockets into central Israel. Super complicated, but basically in 2005, this strip of land right here, the Israeli government now allows Muslims to govern it, right? They have some local authority here. But the group that has won the elections is this group called Hamas, and they're pretty hardcore strict with their Islam, and they really hate Israel. And every once in a while, they will conduct some terrorist attacks. So the USA doesn't like them, right? And some people say, why should we give those people their own country? That's only going to make them stronger. We can't agree to that. So there are a lot of factors here, a lot of issues getting in the way of creating a lasting peace in the region. Several US presidents have tried and failed to get Israel and the Palestinians to agree on a permanent peace. In 2000, at the presidential retreat in Camp David, sometimes this is called the Camp David Accords. Camp David is like the president's hangout in Maryland. That's like a place where they kind of just chillax. President Clinton came close to clinching a deal that would have given the Palestinians more than 90% of the West Bank. So they said, all right, fine, let's come to an agreement. If we can clear out 90% of this and give 90% of this to the Muslims, can we have a deal then? But the Palestinians, under the leadership of this guy Yasser Arafat, said no, because we want all of it. And we also don't want a situation in which the country has two disconnected regions. So he did not accept the peace agreement. In 2008, they tried the same exact thing, only now it was President Bush getting involved. Democrats and Republicans in this country keep trying to resolve the situation. And again, in 2008, they rejected it because it was not a contiguous, meaning all-connected country. No one seems to want to compromise. Everyone has an all or nothing kind of attitude. In fact, if you skip towards the bottom here, something happened in 1978 that was significant. Okay, a Democratic president, Jimmy Carter, in 1978, had the Israeli leader and the Egyptian leader over for dinner in Maryland, and they tried to talk it out. The Egyptian guy is right here, Anwar Sadat, and the world thought that in 1978 they were going to solve this issue because Egypt did something pretty crazy for the time. Egypt told the entire world, I know this is going to sound like not a big deal, told the entire world that Israel has the right to exist and we're not going to ever attack them again. The Muslim countries all flipped out because they were all like in solidarity with this attitude of hatred towards Israel. And here's Egypt saying, no, Israel's cool. We're going to agree to leave them alone from now on. And then Israel gave back the Sinai Peninsula. So if you look between 1967 and today, this territory has gone back to Egypt. That Egyptian guy who took a great step towards peace was assassinated by his own people for being too nice to Israel. A couple years later, an Israeli prime minister got assassinated because he's the one that allowed the Muslims to govern this little tiny piece of land. The Jews were like, unacceptable, you cannot give that back to them. So they assassinated him. And that's kind of a crazy thing. Every time someone tries to compromise, they get assassinated by extremists on either side. Kind of insane how that's going on. A little bit more on this, okay? Two sides also can't agree on the status of Jerusalem or whether Palestinians who were displaced after the war should be allowed to return to their homes. Most importantly is Jerusalem. What do we do with this? Do we split it down the middle? Oh, you can't do that. If you split Israel in half, that means half of it is going to contain all those religious sites. That means one side's going to get those places and one's not. The Muslims don't like the fact that Israel controls the whole thing, okay? And Israel doesn't want it to fall to the Muslims. So again, even just dividing the city down the middle is unacceptable to both sides. So let's just kind of recap that a little bit. Okay, this two-state solution is often proposed as a way to resolve the conflict. The plan often suggested would consist of an independent Israel and an independent state of Palestine that consists of, again, those two pieces of land, West Bank and Gaza Strip. How come Palestinians aren't agreeing to that? What's the common argument they always make? The Muslims and the Jews don't want to compromise and give up any territory. Absolutely. And what's that other argument? Right? Some people say, oh, we're just going to create a nation for Muslims that have West Bank and Gaza Strip. Why do they keep rejecting that? They want all or nothing, definitely, which kind of corresponds to this, all or nothing, no compromise. But you guys remind me, right? What's the problem with the country if it's Gaza Strip and West Bank? Why did the Palestinians say that this is unacceptable? It wouldn't be all connected. Exactly. Good. The Palestinian state would not be contiguous. That's the key word I want you to know, which means all connected. Right? Sometimes they'll say, oh, the contiguous 48 states. Right? That's the United States without Alaska and Hawaii. or the continental US means kind of the same thing. Okay? And that kind of also is what I want you to put. It's a little bit repetitive, and I apologize for that. So just copy and paste this line and also put it for number 11. And that's pretty much the state of affairs right now. Okay? You've got a situation in which you've got a country called Israel, and you've got these little strips of land, West Bank and Gaza Strip, that the people who live there, mostly Muslims, they don't have a country of their own. They live under Israeli occupation. Israeli soldiers patrol the streets. And you have increasing Jewish neighborhoods popping up in the West Bank, and that's making Muslims upset. And you've got a terrorist organization in charge of the Gaza Strip that Israel is upset about because they're launching terrorist attacks. So it's like, where do we go from here? But we got to get somewhere. And US presidents keep on continuing to try to resolve the conflict. And it's important that we do, because for a lot of reasons that we'll get into in a second. You guys remind me, we talked about it yesterday. What is an important resource that comes out of the Middle East? Oil. Okay, so if war is going on, right, and ships have to get through waterways, but there's conflict, those ships are at risk, right? So we want to make sure there's peace. That way we can safeguard the flow of oil out of those places, right? You guys see the gas prices right now. One of the reasons for the gas prices is because there's conflict in the world. When conflict happens, gas prices go through the roof, okay? So we want peace in order to safeguard the transportation of natural resources, such as oil. And peace is also important because terrorist organizations have developed as a result of conflict in Palestine. You guys are doing homework about the country of Iran, okay? A country that we don't have a good relationship with, right? Sometimes people have suspected Iran of like supporting terrorist organizations. Well, one of the reasons why they don't like us so much is because of this Arab-Israeli conflict, right? That we continuously have to support Israel in these wars. Okay, so maybe if we don't have to support Israel in war anymore, maybe Iran wouldn't hate us so much, and maybe we can have less terrorism and more peace and stuff. Okay? One of the reasons why Iran is developing nuclear missiles, supposedly, is to use them on Israel, which scares us a lot. So again, if we can have peace, we can have less tension in the world. Okay? Another thing that's recent with this, in terms of developments, is the moving of the U.S. Embassy building. Has anyone ever been overseas and seen an embassy building or know what that is, an embassy? Okay, so generally, guys, if you, let's say, here's a scenario, right? Let's say I go to Canada and I stole a box of donuts from Tim Hortons, and the Canadian government, it has me on the run, right? I would go to the U.S. Embassy building in Canada to seek some kind of legal representation for my own country. Technically, if I go into that building, I'm stepping onto U.S. soil, even though I'm in another country. So they can help me with legal issues. Maybe there's an issue with my immigration papers or my passport and I can't get back home. The embassy building is there to support you. So the US, right, always a backer of Israel. Since, I forget the exact year, I want to say 1948, our embassy building has been in a city called Tel Aviv, which is up here in northern Israel. A couple years ago, we moved the embassy building to Jerusalem, which is kind of like symbolic. It's basically the United States declaring that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. So you tell me, why might that be controversial, that we moved our US offices to Jerusalem and said basically to the world that we support Israel's full control over Jerusalem? Why might that be kind of a hot topic? Yeah, Palestinians want Jerusalem, right? And they're continuously upset with the fact that we support Israel. And now here we are basically saying to the world that Jerusalem, all of it, belongs to Israel. It's just making the conflict even more intense, right? It's a tough thing for us, though. It's almost like you got to pick which group is going to be on your side. Because by doing this, the government won over the Jewish population hardcore, right? So, oh, wow, U.S. has our back. This is awesome. We fully support this. Jews in the United States fully support the government officials who went along with that. But the Islamic community, not so happy about it. You can't really have a win-win, unfortunately, with this situation. So just to kind of wrap things up, you guys are going to go down to 13. Why might it have been controversial for the U.S. to acknowledge that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel and move its embassy there? It's controversial because Muslims still consider Jerusalem to be an important city, and they have religious sites there. Many Muslims believe Israel should not control it. Okay? And again, it's almost like you can't really win because this question is asking about effects of the announcement. Two things happen. Jewish community, fully on board. Islamic community, not so much. So we're just going to kind of recap that. Jewish community supports USA in this move. Islamic community has reacted with mass protests. I remember when this was a couple of years ago, and on the news, they were just showing people just burning American flags in the streets, right? Which is not an image that's particularly comforting, I would say. All right, guys, so long story short, right? It's a conflict over religious territory. It's a conflict over land. It's yet another example of how Europeans are redrawing maps and not making anybody happy with the partition. Okay, it's again another example of that religious or ethnic conflict in parts of the world that we're having trouble resolving, right? This is the ultimate enduring issue, conflict between Arabs and Israelis in the Middle East, causing all other kinds of issues.